Well, the truth is, no matter how much it rains this year, it will not end our drought. But some people are saying that there is a way to end it, and they're questioning why we're not doing it.
Well, the answers might be in Israel. Our senior investigative reporter, Stephen Stock, just returned from the Middle East. And Stephen, this is about technology and politics in part. What's the problem here?
Well, the problem is essentially we don't have the political will here in California. In fact, guys, scientists say that California right now needs 11 trillion gallons of water just to recover from our current drought. Now, how much is that much water? Consider this. It would have to rain in San Francisco and Oakland 1 inch every day, like it did today, for more than 13 years just to get that much water. We discovered a place where they faced a similar crisis 8 years ago, and now they have so much water there, they sell it to other countries. It looks like California's Central Valley. Rows of crops, fields of cotton, fruit and nut trees as far as the eye can see. All silhouetted by mountains that run alongside the fertile valley. But this isn't the Central Valley. It's not even California. It's Israel. If you really want to find out how to address California's drought, come here like we did to Israel, halfway around the world, where nearly 10 years ago they faced a similar drought crisis and decided to change an entire approach towards water. Now, almost 10 years later, they have more water than they can use.
And the bottom line is the country produces about 20% more water than it consumes currently.
Dr. Glenn Yago was born in Shreveport, Louisiana. He now works here in Israel as Senior Director and Senior Fellow at the Milken Institute. We spoke to him outdoors near his office at the walls surrounding the old city of Jerusalem. So wait a minute. Israel, here in the desert, makes more water than it can use.
Right. We sell it and share it with the Palestinian Authority in Jordan.
Yards away from where we spoke were the remnants of an ancient aqueduct that carried water to Jerusalem for thousands of years. Historically, they know water crisis solutions here. Today, Dr. Yago and his staff are teaming up with experts from Cal Berkeley to try to find large-scale solutions for California's water crisis.
It's not just the drought itself, it's the fact that you have to have a sustainable water system, whether you have El Niños or you don't have El Niños.
We discovered that the solutions to drought here these days aren't based on ancient but rather modern history. Less than a decade ago, Israel instituted a major paradigm shift in its approach to water.
I was sometimes afraid that we will not be able to supply even water even for basic needs.
Shimon Tal retired after serving for 6 years as Israel's top water commissioner during the time that the country faced these critical water shortages.
Today, after doing what we should do, we have an excess amount of water and we are not afraid of drought years and so on.
It was an approach where Israeli leaders made water a national priority, equivalent to fighting terrorism or war.
Water is a strategic material. It's almost like weapons.
Avraham Tene played a leading role in helping Israel gain water independence.
I think that the people of California doesn't understand yet what the problems they are facing. They don't understand yet how huge these problems are.
What is confusing is why people think that it could rain and it could solve this.
It's not just the Israelis warning us either. Laura Shenkar is a principal at the Artemis Water Strategy Group, a water consultancy project that works with major private corporations based at the Presidio in San Francisco.
We simply don't have enough water.
It all may look familiar, but this isn't the Central Valley or even Silicon Valley in California. Instead, it's the Negev Desert in Israel, where they generate so much recycled water they can't store it all. At this recycling plant, developed with the assistance of the Jewish National Fund, they clean as much as 10% of all recycled water used in Israel. Water that meets not only Israeli safety standards, but also German and U.S. EPA standards as well.
We didn't have any choice.
In fact, as much as 60% of all water in Israel used by agriculture comes from recycled or regenerated water sources, not drinking water, carried by these purple pipes you see everywhere here. In comparison, less than 7% of California agriculture uses any type of recycled water.
You see a lot of green.
We found another technology here on this kibbutz, or collective farm, where they developed and perfected drip irrigation techniques 50 years ago. We are in a desert.
You're in a desert. And all that is planted and irrigated.
Now, at least 75% of all Israel's crops are watered through drip irrigation, generating crop yields nearly twice that of other fields. In California, less than 40% of our fields have drip irrigation. To get an idea how good drip irrigation is, consider this. See the middle of these rows? There's no weeds, no grass, nothing. Nothing grows here. The only thing that grows here are the crops, irrigated by drip irrigation. In fact, we found farmers in California's Central Valley still using flood irrigation, a technique from 100 years ago that experts say has scientifically been shown to be inefficient, wasteful, and ultimately counterproductive.
Summer you need this kind of amount, and winter you need less.
Also in Israel's new water portfolio, desalination. Plants like this one, the largest of its kind in the world, take seawater and convert it into fresh drinking water. Israel has 5 desalination plants, some more than 10 years old. Altogether, they have the capacity to produce more than 50% of all the drinking water for the entire country. Contrast that to California with only 1 plant, this one in Carlsbad, outside San Diego, which just started to produce fresh water late last month and will only provide about a quarter of the drinking water needed by San Diego. What needs to change here in California?
I'd like to see a few leaders step forward in California who see an opportunity to drive the success of advanced water technology, the way that California has driven the application of advanced renewable technology.
Why haven't we done that?
I think in California the basic answer is that it hasn't been a priority.
Why don't we get this when it comes to water? Avraham Tene's answer to that question speaks to the need for California to change too, whether or not El Nino brings more rain than we can handle.
I believe that you don't understand yet your problem, and this is a huge problem. It's not going to be better.
If we don't do anything, what happens?
People will die.
Now, we found several Silicon Valley companies right here in this area that have already developed technologies to help solve this water crisis, but they can't get any traction here in California. They can't get their technology to be accepted. So they've taken their business overseas and sold to other countries. We will explore that in the next part of our series, which airs next week. In a state that leads the world in reducing greenhouse gases and cutting-edge technology, we wanted to know that question, the simple question: why is California so far behind when it comes to solving a water crisis? We discovered that here in Silicon Valley, companies have actually developed technologies to help solve the drought, but can't get any real traction here in California because they're wrapped up in red tape.
See it separated over there?
If you want to see the latest in high-tech innovation that creates fresh drinking water,
This makes 1 ton of water a day.
look no further than this high-tech startup called Trevi Systems, located in an office park in Petaluma.
We're trying to get it down to about a quarter of the energy of reverse osmosis.
It's where Trevi CEO John Webley proudly shows off a process designed and manufactured here that mimics the skin of a fish to take salt out of seawater, creating fresh drinking water without using high pressure or a lot of energy. So essentially you're using a chemical, a molecule, to draw salt water through a membrane to make it clean water.
Correct. The membrane's doing all the work, so you know, it removes the salt.
That's the neat thing about
Down the road, this San Leandro-based startup called Pasteurization Technologies combines on-site renewable energy generation with their process to treat human wastewater and make it reusable.
every day here in the San Francisco Bay Area, about 500 million gallons of usable water gets used once and put into the Bay or the Pacific Ocean.
While they use different technologies to produce fresh water, both companies face a common problem. With the exception of some small projects, they cannot get any municipality or private group to back their technology here in California. So Pasteurization Technologies took its innovations and product overseas, signing a multi-million-dollar contract to provide fresh water in Australia. If they hadn't taken their product overseas,
We'd be out of business.
Trevi Systems just signed a multi-million-dollar agreement with Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.
At my age, I can't wait long enough for the permit. I don't want it on my gravestone.
Both companies ran into what more than 24 experts described to us as a major problem in California's search for solutions to the drought: the state's multi-layered and laborious bureaucratic approach to water management. As an example, there are 412 different water districts in California, 2,600 small mutual water agencies. Some districts, such as Boron Community Services District, have only 600 customers, or Green Valley District with 1,000 customers. Compare that with districts such as East Bay Mud with 1.5 million customers. All of the districts have different financial means, rules, approaches, and tolerances for taking risks when it comes to new water technologies. Some districts still don't even have water meters.
But right now we can't get the permits because everybody puts us into litigation.
So you go elsewhere.
So you go elsewhere.
You go to the Middle East.
You go to the Middle East.
Then companies have to navigate California's state structure itself. There's no one state agency or department in charge. Among those departments that oversee water policy are California's Department of Water Resources, the state EPA, the Coastal Commission, the Association of California Water Agencies, the Department of Natural Resources, or the Department of Business Oversight, any one of which can hold up the process or kill a good idea altogether.
The left hand and the right hand don't necessarily communicate.
The reality is we've taken water for granted in California.
Because of the state's history with all these different agencies, California State Assemblyman Richard Bloom says change will be difficult, but that it must come from the legislature and the governor's office. When we traveled to Israel, we met up with Bloom, the former mayor of Santa Monica, who was leading a California delegation to Israel at the World Water Technology, or WATEC, conference.
The bottom line is there are things happening here in Israel, for example, that we're not taking advantage of.
Compare California's system to Israel's. Yes, Israel is a smaller country with a population and land size comparable to just the Bay Area alone. But when it comes to water technology, we discovered Israel is more nimble, more accepting of innovation. And where there are hundreds of water agencies and multiple state departments in California overseeing water issues, in Israel there is just one, the Water Authority.
I'm a little impatient with getting to an answer.
Like us, Stephen DeBerry, founder and CFO of San Francisco-based Bronze Investments, also traveled to Israel to find out why that country's success in water policy can't be replicated here in California.
You know, as an investor, I'm seeing lots of technologies that I think can help resolve some of the issues that we face.
Are there barriers to innovation and to developing these technologies here in California?
We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. A lot of these problems have been solved. We can look at Israel. We should be able to go much faster than they did. And so if there's a place for us to innovate, I think it's really on the regulatory front.
Crises are wonderful for getting a message across.
As Director of Water and Natural Resources for East Bay Mud, Richard Sykes defends the current system, saying it has worked in California for more than 100 years. Although he does agree that changing times and challenges may call for a change in some of the ways that California approaches water. Is one of the problems with the way we're currently set up is we have too many water districts, over 400 of them?
I wouldn't say it's too many. I would say we need to work effectively together to solve regionally. If you do that, then it isn't too many. If you can't do that because of the number of the water districts, then maybe you're right, it could be too many.
In California, you've got to be inventive.
Stephen Zecker has studied these issues as a senior fellow at the Milken Innovation Center in Jerusalem.
We can hear the argument that, oh, well, that's a risky technology in California, which we hear often. The fact is we're a test bed of that technology here. We've proven that it works, and we've proven that it can go to scale.
So why haven't we done it yet?
I mean, the fact is that it hasn't been first and foremost. I mean, you've had 5 years of drought, but the behavior has not been forced. Even if it rained tomorrow, it's not going to get better. And that the worst thing that could happen is that people would move off of this idea of necessity right now. Now's the chance to invent. Now's the chance to take a risk to invent a solution that actually makes a difference.
Here's an example of the problem. Trevi's CEO told me that when he tried to find someone here in California to talk about his project, he couldn't find anyone to even call, anyone who would take his calls or make any decisions. He tried dozens of phone calls and finally gave up and took his business, you guessed it, to the Middle East. Raj, we traveled to Israel, where about a decade ago they faced a drought similar to the one California experiences right now. Right now, Israel has more water than it can use. We discovered that some of their solutions are slowly but surely taking hold here in California. But in order to solve our drought problems for good, it will take a major change in our approach to water.
So we had to learn how to acclimate, how to change our systems, how to completely redevelop our whole strategy.
Seth Rosso isn't your stereotypical Central Valley farmer.
We've reduced water a little bit.
He's an alfalfa grower with an MBA from Fresno State who has been using drip irrigation on his fields for the last 5 years.
To moisten up.
Not just because it saves water, which it does, but also because it makes him more money. Lots more money.
We've increased our yields so much that if you start actually calculating the dry matter pounds per drop of water, we've increased 62.5% of our crop per drop of water.
All because of this plastic irrigation pipe system made by an Israeli firm called Netafim. The company now also has an office and manufacturing plant in Fresno.
It's not a familiar type of irrigation to many growers who've perhaps grown up with either flood irrigation or pivot irrigation.
As CEO of Netafim USA, John Vakupitz faces the challenge of trying to convince Central Valley farmers like Rosso to change historical irrigation techniques, especially when it can cost a lot of money up front to install the irrigation system.
And we spent a lot of time trying to educate growers that drip irrigation is actually a very easy to use technology. It's actually a very durable form of irrigation.
This drip irrigation technology was first developed 50 years ago in Israel on this kibbutz, or collective farm, located in the Negev desert.
And we are in the end of the summer.
And we're in a desert.
Yeah, and
we are in a desert.
Totally desert.
As head of Netafim's Commercial Americas division in Israel, Natan Barak has a unique perspective. Barak believes California's government must do more with grant and financial incentives to encourage farmers to use these new technologies.
And we shouldn't wait until we have a desert in order to start trying to bloom it.
But not everyone here in California is buying that line. Most farmers are not following Seth Rosso's lead. In fact, experts say less than 40% of all California farmers use drip irrigation. If you want an illustration about the different approaches to water policy here in California, consider this. This is the San Joaquin River, the middle of it. There's no water anywhere. And yet less than 100 feet away, flood irrigation is being used in a field. While some farmers still defend the practice of literally opening large pipes and flooding acres of fields with several inches of water, dozens of water policy experts told us that the 100-year-old flooding technology is inefficient and wasteful because more than half the water simply evaporates. And it's not just innovative irrigation techniques in Israel that are working. At plants like this one outside Beersheba, Israel recycles 85% of its urban wastewater, sometimes 2 and 3 times. The water is treated not only to Israeli, but also to EPA safety and purification standards. And because of its widespread use, things like this, acres and acres of pomegranate trees, now grow in the Negev desert.
There was no water.
Farmer Yigal Aftabi remembers when nothing grew here because it was a desert. Yes. Still is, in fact. So you don't care if it rains anymore?
Not at all. I don't depend on rain at all. The rain is an extra for me. I don't need the rain anymore.
Just like in California, there are critics of recycled water who worry that the filters won't catch everything.
And it goes through a pump.
That's why chemists at Hebrew University continue to search for molecular-sized filters to block even the smallest human waste molecules that might get through the robust recycling filters.
So we're trying to find a niche where the robust technologies don't work.
Professor Yael Mishael, a member of the Robert H. Smith Faculty of Agriculture at Hebrew University, works to create molecular filters, even though right now she says there's no scientific evidence that recycled water poses a risk, especially when used on agriculture.
But we have this 1, 2, 5% of what these persistent pollutants, evasive pollutants, they have a variety of names, that slip by the system. And that's where we come in with our specially tailored materials to trap them, to catch them.
The Carlsbad desalination plant is a 3-stage process.
Then there's the most expensive and energy-intensive technology of all, desalination, taking seawater and turning it into fresh drinking water.
It's ready to be pushed into the...
Mark Lambert, CEO of IDE Americas, the Israeli company that runs this plant in Carlsbad outside San Diego, took us on a tour.
Seawater desalination could perhaps become 20 or 30% of the water portfolio.
It is the largest plant of its kind in North America, cleaning 54 million gallons of seawater every day. by forcing the seawater at high pressure through long tubes filled with dense filters, a process called reverse osmosis.
It's water that's always going to be there. It's never going to go away. It isn't dependent on snowpack or rainfall.
Desalination is something so important.
Miriam Gaigon, director of the Solutions Department at IDE Israel, also took us on a tour of Carlsbad's sister plant called Sorek, located outside Tel Aviv. Only this is the largest desalination plant in the world. It produces more than 3 times more fresh water than that plant in Carlsbad. Just about 10 years ago, Israel made a commitment to desalination because Israeli leaders said it was the only way for the country to become truly water independent.
They understood that we cannot depend on the weather. We cannot depend on rain anymore.
In fact, the 5 Israeli desalination plants provide currently half of all the fresh drinking water for the entire country of Israel, while the Carlsbad plant only provides about a quarter of the water needed by San Diego. As for desalination critics who say it takes too much energy or produces salty, briny wastewater that can hurt marine life, Mark Lambert says the process and those issues are being addressed through newer, evolving technology.
We need to change our approach to water. We need to look at it as an input to a production process, an economic driving process, and realize that the value of water shouldn't be free.
Now, top state officials here in California agree, and they say that many citizens need a deeper appreciation for the true value of water. In fact, during our investigation, we talked to 75 different experts, scientists, and policymakers from Sacramento all the way to Israel. Every one of them agreed on one thing. Solving this crisis isn't about hoping for more rain and snow, but about changing California's historical attitude and policies towards water. From school playgrounds to city skylines to fields of agriculture as far as the eye can see. Life in Israel doesn't look so different from life in California and the Bay Area. But look closer at the rainwater capture system, designed and run by 4th graders.
And that's all the rainwater.
Or at the roofs of nearly every building. There, cisterns to collect rainwater everywhere you look, instead of satellite dishes or TV antennas that you see here. Or at underground drip irrigation that uses a quarter of the water and produces double the plant yield, instead of spray irrigation that Californians use everywhere, from their front yards to their fields of crops.
Because it's all the time being innovated.
To get a sense of that difference, we spoke to former Israeli President Shimon Peres at his appearance at the annual Water Technology Conference in Tel Aviv. We wanted to know, what can we learn from you? What can California learn from you when it comes to water?
That you can overcome the shortage of it and make California, as usual, green, beautiful, with oranges.
We took the same question to Felicia Marcus, the chairwoman of California's Water Resources Control Board, which sets regulatory policy for drinking water and surface water quality, as well as mediating disputes involving the state's water rights laws. What can we learn from Israel?
Well, I think with Israel, you just have the example of a nation state that's managed to look at their water situation in the cool light of day and do what it takes.
Compare Israel's approach to water to California's. Israeli citizens use about 62 gallons of water per person per day. California, 80 gallons. Israel recycles 85% of its wastewater. California, less than 7. Israel artificially produces more than 60% of the water used for agriculture. California, less than 10. Then there is the way water here in California is distributed and shared among residents. Who owns it, who gets to use it, and who regulates it.
Our system is based on how we fight with each other.
Currently, there are 412 different water districts in California, 2,600 smaller mutual water agencies. From farmers to urban dwellers to environmentalists, everyone is vying for their right to water. In fact, some water rights date back to 1886 or earlier in California, when settlers put a stake down in the ground next to a stream, and the rights to that water have been passed down to generations ever since. In comparison, Israel is a desert and is smaller than California, but it's similar in size and population to the Bay Area. So even when comparing Israel to the Bay Area, that country still leads this area by a wide margin when it comes to per capita water consumption, water recycling, stormwater recovery, irrigation, and the biggest contrast of all, desalination. Do we still need a change when it comes to how we govern water in this state?
Well, I'm sticking with making the system we have work better, which is at its heart a 19th century system that got tuned up a bit in the 20th, and we have 20th, and in some places 21st century infrastructure, but there's a long way to go.
We should streamline the way we administer and oversee surface water rights.
Ellen Hannock says California can't get better until change happens. Hannock serves as director at the San Francisco-based Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group now calling for policy reforms in California that they say would help solve the problems we found during our investigation.
Right now, California has this kind of arcane, complex system that nobody would have created if we started from scratch.
Do we need reform?
We need reform, and what we're suggesting is something that really can harness the creativity of Californians around the state in different watersheds.
In mid-November, the PPIC issued this report calling for changes in the oversight of water rights, trading, and environmental uses.
What we find is that during this drought, there have been some warts have been revealed in our water allocation system, let's say, and some complexities that we could really simplify to just streamline our system so that it's more efficient and effective.
So the alarm bells are to prepare for the future where we have more years like this where we have no snowpack.
Marcus says that she, Governor Jerry Brown, and many other ordinary Californians now recognize that we can no longer rely on just rain and snow. She says leaders in Sacramento are now planning for 40-year and 100-year droughts in the future.
We've got a real water bond.
It's one of the reasons they successfully convinced California voters to approve a $7.5 billion bond measure to pay for water supply infrastructure projects, storage, and watershed protection.
I think the next decade is going to be a decade of experimentation where major urban centers, depending on what their plumbing systems are, you're going to see an explosion of effort in conservation, recycling, and stormwater capture.
But Marcus also admits, in light of our investigation and what it revealed, it's not enough.
Are we really ready, or do we need to do more? Do we need to accelerate this?
I think we need to accelerate, but I think we need to show the voters that we can spend this money wisely.
Do we need to sort of become a unified state when it comes to our approach to water? Or is there still too much he said, she said, it's my water, it's your water, that kind of thing going on?
People are almost so adept at fighting with each other over water, it's hard to stop and figure out how we can all get better together.
And Marcus says unless we stop fighting, nothing will change. Now, we have a lot more on this subject, a very important subject, including timelines, maps, charts, behind-the-scenes slideshows, even video travelogues from Israel and back. And we've put all this material on our website on a special web page called Surviving the Drought. We investigate the water crisis. Just go to NBCBayArea.com.